Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News, and welcome to this week's edition of the Federal Crime Report, where we examine some of the most significant criminal prosecutions, sentencings, and federal law enforcement action from across the United States. Tonight, our focus is on the U.S. Midwest District, where federal prosecutors, the FBI, DEA, ATF, IRS, Criminal Investigation, Homeland Security Investigation, U.S. Marshal, and countless state and local partners continue pursuing complex investigations involving organized crimes, violent gangs, public corruption, child exploitation, large-scale narcotic trafficking, financial fraud, and international fugitives. Before we begin, it's important to remember that federal criminal complaints, indictments, and criminal charges are merely allegations only. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of law. We begin tonight in Minnesota. Federal prosecutors announced a major development in one of the nation's largest pandemic fraud investigations. Abdirham Abdali Ilda, a long-time fugitive charged in multi-million-dollar Feeding Our Future fraud scheme, has been returned to Minnesota after authorities located him in Somalia. According to the Department of Justice, Abdullah was surrendered throughout extensive cooperation involving the FBI, Somalia's national intelligence and security agencies, the Somalia Police Force, IRS Criminal Investigation, and the Department of Justice Office of International Affairs. Originally indicted in 2022, Abdullah now faces 31 federal counts, including wire fraud conspiracy, bribery involving federal programs, and money laundering conspiracy. His return represents another significant milestone in the government's ongoing effort to recover millions of dollars in taxpayer allegedly stolen from the federal child nutrition program during the COVID-19 pandemic. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentencing of 77-year-old Leon Whitenfeather Sr., who received 5.5 years in federal prison after admitting to sexually abuse multiple minors while serving as their caretaker on a Red Lake Indian reservation between 2009 and 2019. Upon release, Whitefeather will remain under federal sex offender supervision for 5 years. Meanwhile, prosecutors secured another guilty plea in the federal RICO case targeting the Minneapolis street gang known as the Lowe's. 21-year-old Damari Douglas admitted to participating in criminal enterprise, including voluntarily manslaughter and illegally acquiring firearms throughout straw purchasers, while prohibited from possessing guns due to a prior felony conviction. Authorities say the gang has long been linked to murders, attempted murders, narcotic trafficking, robberies, carjacking, firearm trafficking, and intimidation throughout the North Minneapolis. Douglas now faces the possibility of life in federal prison when he is sentenced. Next, we head to Wisconsin. Federal authorities in Wisconsin announced the successful conclusion of a multi-year Homeland Security Task Force investigation that dismantled a large fentanyl trafficking organization operating throughout Dan County. The investigation ultimately resulted in 13 federal convictions involving narcotic trafficking, firearm offenses, and money laundering. Investigators traced the operation back to Arizona, where kilograms of fentanyl pills were mailed into Madison throughout commercial shipping services. During the investigation, agents conducted more than 20 controlled purchases while executing numerous search warrants across the region. In total, authorities seized nearly 5 kilograms of fentanyl pills, 10 firearms, and more than $97,000 in cash. The final defendant, Kevin Simmons of Tucson, Arizona, was sentenced on June 30th to 12 years in federal prison, bringing the lengthy prosecution to conclusion. Federal prosecutors say investigations demonstrated the growing effectiveness of coordinated efforts between federal, state, and local agencies to disrupt organized responsible for distributing deadly synthetic opioids into communities across the Midwest. Continuing on into Michigan, federal prosecutors in Michigan announced multiple major developments involving child exploitation, international fugitives, and international drug trafficking. In Detroit, James Andrew Talon of Topsy received 10 years in federal prison after investigators determined he distributed thousands of child sexual abuse material involving images and videos over nearly 2 years. According to the FBI, the material reached individuals on every continent except Antarctica, illustrating the truly global scope of online child exploitation networks. Federal authorities also confirmed the capture of fugitive Geronimo Van de Marrero Garrett in Mexico. Garrett, a convicted felon, is accused of federal narcotic trafficking and related state firearm offenses after investigators alleged recovered 10 kilograms of cocaine, an additional 3 kilograms of cocaine from his residence, and more than $600,000 in suspected drug proceedings. His arrest followed a coordinated international operation involving the DEA, FBI, U.S. Marshal Services, and Mexico law enforcement. Meanwhile, in Grand Rapids, Colombian national appeared in federal court following their extradition from Colombia. Prosecutors allege Carlos Andres Rando Ipa and Manuel Augusto Munza Barranca participated in an international conspiracy to distribute and import large quantities of cocaine designated for the United States. Federal officials say the extradition sent a clear message that international narcotic trafficking cannot evade prosecutors simply by remaining outside the country's border. If convicted, both men face mandatory minimum federal prison sentence of 10 years with the potential penalties of up to life in prison. Now we move to Ohio. Federal prosecutors in Ohio announced several significant sentencing involving child exploitation and large-scale drug trafficking. In Cleveland, 27-year-old Christopher Jackson of Elyria was sentenced to 15 and a half years in federal prison after pleading guilty to receiving, distributing, and possessing child sexual abuse material. Investigators concluded an online exploitation investigation identified Jackson and later seized nearly 1,000 images and more than 300 videos depicting child sexual abuse. According to court records, Jackson admitted to possessing such materials for more than 17 years. Following his prison sentence, he will serve 15 years of supervised release. In Akron, career offender Robert Farram received more than 20 years in federal prison after a lengthy investigation uncovering major narcotic operation. During the execution of the federal search warrant, agents recovered methamphetamine, cocaine, fentanyl, 28 firearms, including one equipped with a legal machine gun conversion device, drug trafficking equipment, marijuana, ecstasy, and cash. Federal prosecutors cite Farram's extensive criminal history is seeking the lengthy sentence. Also in Summit County, Darren Tibbetts was sentenced to a combined 12 years in federal prison after authorities determined he resumed trafficking heroin and fentanyl while on supervised release for an earlier federal drug conviction. The new sentence includes additional prison time and violating the conditions of his federal supervision. Next, we head to Indiana. Federal prosecutors in Indianapolis announced the conclusion of a long-running travel insurance fraud investigation that resulted in prison sentence and restitution order of 8 individuals involving $1.2 million in conspiracy. According to prosecutors, Jennifer Fleener, a claims supervisor for a travel insurance company, exploited her position over several years by approving fraudulent insurance claims submitted by family members, friends, co-workers, and recruited participants, many of whom were never intended to travel as a representative of their insurance application. Investigators say the conspiracy generated more than 441 fraudulent claims, resulting in loss of exceeding $1.19 million. Jennifer Fleener received nearly 5 years in federal prison, while her former husband, Mike Fleener, was sentenced to 4 years. Other participants received shorter prison terms or probation depending upon their level of involvement, while all defendants were ordered to pay restitution. Federal prosecutors described the case as a sophisticated insider fraud scheme that abused public trust in corporate systems for personal financial gain over several years. Continuing on into Illinois, federal prosecutors across northern Illinois announced several significant sentencing involving narcotic trafficking, public corruption, and violent robberies. In Rockerford, Bradley Walters was sentenced to more than 24 years in federal prison after investigators recovered more than 1 kilogram of fentanyl pills, large quantities of methamphetamine, and other controlled substances from his business during the execution of a federal search warrant. The investigation followed multiple controlled drug purchases conducted by law enforcement. In Chicago, former Summit Police Chief John Kronsky was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison after a federal jury convicted him of bribery conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors provided that Kronsky accepted cash payments in exchange for helping facilitate the transfer of a liquor license while serving as a village chief of police. The case underscores the Justice Department continues emphasizing on combating public corruption at every level of government. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentencing of Perry Maple, a member of the violent robbery crew responsible for a series of brazen daytime robberies targeting armored trucks, banks, and ATM technicians throughout the Chicago suburbs. Authorities say the crew stole hundreds of thousands of dollars while terrorizing victims in crowded public areas. Maple, who admitted to participating in multiple armed robbery, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. We begin our final stretch in Iowa. Federal prosecutors announced multiple significant sentencings involving methamphetamine trafficking and obstruction of justice. In Sussex City, 31-year-old Tyler McGalley of Fort Dodge was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison after admitting to conspire to distribute methamphetamine and making multiple sales to cooperating witnesses. Prosecutors say the investigation accumulated a high-speed pursuit that exceeded 100 miles per hour before officers recovered approximately 145 grams of methamphetamine and additional drug distribution of evidence. Federal prosecutors also announced the lengthy sentence for Floyd Clifford Coast Jr. and Dennis Lawson following convicted ties to a drug trafficking operation and disappearance of 18-year-old Sonny Schmark in 2019. Judge Leonard T. Strands stated that Coast intentionally caused Schreck's death and then covered the crime. Coast received 35 years in federal prison, with Lawson, who was facing 10 years for obstruction-related offenses after threatening a witness. Although the federal conviction center of drug, firearm, and obstruction charges, prosecutors described the case as one of the most disturbing investigations handled in the district in recent years. Next, we move to Missouri. Federal authorities across Missouri report major developments involving murder-for-hire, organization drug trafficking, money laundering, and child exploitation. In Cape Girardeau, Matthew Alsop admitted to attempting to hire someone to murder his wife during a divorce proceeding. According to prosecutors, Alsop provided cash, a firearm, detailed directions, and photographs of the intended victim resident to an individual who was actually working undercover with law enforcement. He is scheduled to be sentenced at a later date. In St. Louis, Derek Rocket received 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to participating in a long-running cocaine trafficking and international money laundering conspiracy. Prosecutors say millions of dollars in drug proceedings were routed through a sophisticated laundering network connected to Mexico and China before investigators dismantled the organization. Federal prosecutors also announced that Donald Eugene Fields II, a former FBI most wanted fugitive, was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after admitting to child sexual trafficking involving a minor over several years. The court describes the crime as a warranting extreme punishment. Continuing on, we move now to Kentucky. Federal prosecutors in Kentucky announced several lengthy prison sentencing involving narcotic trafficking and child exploitation. In Frankfort, Donald DeMille Clay was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after investigators uncovered evidence that continued trafficking cocaine while on supervised release for an earlier federal cocaine conviction. Authorities seized cocaine hidden inside a specifically constructed compartment attached to a custom poker table. In Louisville, Sean Bentonson received 18 years in federal prison, while Justin Cummins was sentenced to 7 years for methamphetamine trafficking and related firearm offenses following a joint federal investigation. Perhaps the most severe sentence announced this month involves Quentin Dawtonson of Louisville, who was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison after a federal jury convicted him on 9 child exploitation charges, including production, receipt, distribution, and possession of child sexual abuse material involving a young child. The sentence also included a lifetime of supervised release following imprisonment. Finally, we conclude in Arkansas. Federal prosecutors announced the result of Operation Return of Sender, a sweeping multi-state methamphetamine investigation targeting a large-scale trafficking organization operating throughout central Arkansas. Following a 2-year investigation, federal authorities unsealed an indictment charging 23 individuals. 14 suspects are currently in custody, while additional defendants remain fugitive. Investigators allege the operation transported drug proceeds from Arkansas to California before methamphetamine shipments were mailed back through the commercial delivery services for distribution throughout central Arkansas. According to prosecutors, law enforcement ultimately seized more than 312 pounds of methamphetamine, 4 firearms, including stolen weapons, and approximately $35,000 in cash during the coordinated enforcement operation. Federal officials described the investigation as another example of successful cooperation among the DEA, FBI, Homeland Security Investigation, U.S. Postal Inspection Services, state police agencies, and local law enforcement working together to dismantle sophisticated interstate narcotic organizations. Those are some of the most significant federal criminal cases reported in the U.S. Midwest districts. From international extradition and violent gang prosecutions to major drug trafficking investigations, public corruption cases, financial fraud, and child exploitation convictions, federal law enforcement agencies continue pursuing complex investigations across the Midwest through coordinated efforts involving local, state, and national and international partnership. Once again, federal criminal complaints, indictments, and criminal charges are all allegations only. Every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of law. For continued coverage of federal law enforcement, federal courts, major criminal investigations across the United States, continue following Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent. Thank you for joining us this evening for this week's Federal Crime Report. Have a safe evening, and we'll see you on the next one. Good night.